A very good afternoon to everyone who's joining us this afternoon for our African Feminist Book Worlds discussion. We're hoping over these next 2 days, of course, you're able to join us and join in the conversation as we host some of the most relevant and thought-provoking books on issues of memory, of African women mobilizing themselves, issues of language, of intimacy, and also issues of spirituality and themes on memory. Over these past 2 days, our authors and colleagues here will be joined in discussions as we tease out some of the ways in which women position themselves in the public space and make themselves visible in spaces where they would be rendered invisible instead, or rather erased. And we're hoping that you can join us in the chat section. And if you're joining us from the live stream, please feel free to engage with us and leave your comments and questions that we'll bring into the discussion as we go throughout the day. Just to give us an official opening, I'd like to call the Interim Director of the Center for Women and Gender Studies, Dr. Babala Magogwana, to the platform. Dr. Magogwana.
Thank you so much, Spokazi, and thank you so much to everyone that is here today. Colleagues, students, friends, and the community members. I'm sorry that we are seemingly that we're everywhere. It's just that there are quite a number of things that are happening behind the closed doors. I would like to welcome all of you who are joining us for the first time in this platform. And also I would like to welcome the friends of the Center for Women and Gender Studies, the chair for African Feminist Imagination, and most importantly, I would like to welcome all the African feminist writers that are here today, Molweni, and everyone that is joining us online. I see quite a number of people, the familiar names on our attendees. I see our Dean of Humanities, Professor Maseko, that is also joining us. Thank you, colleagues. Welcome to everyone that has joined us for the first time. I've noted all the people that were in our workshop in the past 2 days. Thank you, colleagues. Welcome. I just thought, let me just reflect a bit before I can hand over to Ulihle and Upumla. When we opened the Center for Women and Gender Studies in October 2019, we did envision a vibrant African feminist space that could offer deep intergenerational intellectual engagements on various works of African thinkers, especially African women and queer scholars across the globe. We wanted a space where African women thinkers can just have conversation without having to explain themselves or rediscovering the past works. And also, we were hoping that everyone who comes into that space would be able to take the African feminist standpoint as a point of departure. And we also thought that this would be a beautiful space to have students with their elders, the people who have done this work before. Some of them are here, obviously, and the people who are still with us and some who are still yet to be born. And also the most important thing was to engage other ideologies, philosophies, practices, and methodologies in our own terms as African feminists. Together with our partners in the province, across the province, we're hoping that we can build an intergenerational space that takes seriously the African women's work. And we know that sometimes African feminism is not homogeneous in different ways, but we share, amongst other things, our commitment to the African continent, African people across the globe and the diaspora, and also the intersecting approach of oppressions on Black women all over the world. This launch of the African Feminist Book Worlds comes after the launch of the SARChI Chair in African Feminist Imagination, occupied by our Prof. Phumla Dineo-Qola, which seeks to train young graduates and facilitate learning in the long-established heritages of African feminist thinking and methodologies within the creative genres of arts. African Feminist Book Worlds is designed to celebrate, among many, African feminist books that have been recently published. This year's celebration is building on last year's critical African feminist reflections on the theme Gender, Arts, and Heritage. Last year, we reflected on how the intersections of gender, memory, and creativity shape what is remembered, with Professor Janine Jones, Dr. Tozama April, Thandiswa Mazwai, Celeste Nduli, and we finished the month of September and October with a Gender Film Festival, partnering up with one of the award-winning filmmakers, Xoliswa Sithole. The erasure of women's resistance and experiences in the official memory in the post-apartheid South Africa echoes similar erasures in other post-independent African contexts. Such elision contributes to the masculine memorialization of history and its material forms of remembrance, continuing to impede on the memory and generation of future knowledge projects. Turning to this archival work for African women's histories, stories, and experiences is part of the project of the Nelson Mandela Center for Women and Gender Studies with its partners across the province. In addition to this investment by CWGS, the chair in African Feminist Imagination surfaces the theoretical possibilities that emerge from ongoing creative and intellectual work. In 2021, we tend to ask questions about theoretical generative books recently published by these African feminists that are here today. Obviously, you would have noticed that we are not particular about the genre of the books because we are trying to stick to what our post-colonial feminist Spivak's insistence that we interpret wording and wielding. We deliberately foreground the intertwined theoretical, conceptual, and aesthetic interventions made by the selected books so that we can ask the kind of questions about the future that we all envision as African feminists. These books, they seek to ask what kind of worlds do these books imagine, confront, and undo. As we seek to engage, answer some of these questions, colleagues, help me to welcome all the invited authors. We know that these are not all the books that have been published by African feminists in the past year or two, but we hope that you will enjoy the conversations between these beautiful and very imaginative authors that we have here today and tomorrow. These conversations are part of the bigger project to systematically pull together the African feminist keywords by Professor Phumla Qola and myself. All the authors will be introduced properly by Uspoka Zitau as she goes through the program. I would like to mention that we really are privileged to have you colleagues, and also we enjoy a lot of support from our Vice Chancellor, Professor Mutwa, and our DVC, Professor Andre Kiet. This is why we could be able to create a space like this one that is not apologetic about our roots in terms of African feminist heritages. With those few words, colleagues, I would like to welcome every one of you. Please feel free to enjoy yourself, engage, but most importantly, let us all imagine this world that we've always wanted as African feminists. Together with our students today, you are welcome, colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Babalo Mapokwana. And just referring to the books that we will be in discussion today, we're starting off with Lihle Ngobozi's Mothers of the Nation, Manyano Women in South Africa. And then we'll be followed up by Surfacing on Being Black and Feminist in South Africa. by Prof. Desiree Lewis and Prof. Habeba Badaroon. And then lastly, Ilifa by Dr. Atambile Masola. And just as a way of welcoming our first two speakers, Ulihle and Prof. Gola, I'm just going to read a brief bio on both of our speakers as they prepare themselves to join us in the discussion. Ulihle Ngobozi is a lecturer in governance, public policy, and gendered approaches to development. She is the author of The Mothers of the Nation, Manyano Women in South Africa, a book that explores the intersection between the Black church, liberation theologies, and an African feminist analysis of the public sphere in South Africa. She has worked as a senior research consultant in varied ministries, where she has been responsible for policy drafting, for policy framework development, and providing early evidence research for policy positions. She graduated from Rose University with a master's degree in political science and international relations in 2017. She explored how the Women's Manyano Church Group offers a space for Black women's public performance of citizenship. Ngobozi holds a postgraduate. In addition to that, Ngobozi holds the Alan Gray Center of Leadership Ethics Fellowship, and previously she worked as a researcher for IRANI, which focused on the development of LGBTI rights in Southern Africa. And the second speaker, I'm just welcoming to the platform, Prof. Pumla Dineo Gola. She's a professor of literary and cultural studies and is the current NRF SARChI chair in African Feminist Imaginations. She has previously been professor of African literature at the University of the Witwatersrand, senior lecturer in the Department of English and Classical Culture at the University of the Free State, and chief research specialist in the Societies, Culture, and Identities Research Program of the Human Sciences Research Council. Prof. Gola is a graduate of the University of Cape Town and Warwick in the UK. She holds a DPhil in post-colonial studies from the University of Munich in Germany. Gola is the author of the groundbreaking study on slave memory in South Africa, titled What is Slavery to Me? Post-colonial slave memory in post-apartheid South Africa, and the landmark Rape, a South African Nightmare, which won the 2016 Sunday Times Alan Paton Award for Nonfiction. Her other books are A Renegade Called Simpiwe and Reflecting Rogue Inside the Mind of a Feminist. And most recently, Prof. Gola has released Miriam Tlali, Writing Freedom with the HSRC Press, an introductory text on the pioneering Black South African feminist novelist, short story writer, and essayist Miriam Tlali, as well as Female Fear Factory, which was published by MF Books in Southern Africa. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Lihle and Prof. Gola to the platform.
Thank you very much, Spogazi. Good afternoon, colleagues. I think it's good morning for Professor Badaroon. Thank you to both the colleagues that have joined us on the online webinar and all of our friends and colleagues who've joined us on the YouTube clip, on the YouTube channel, my apologies. As well as, of course, the leadership of the university that have joined and have supported the Center for Women and Gender Studies and the chair in African Feminist Imagination. I am so excited to see all of the names in the tiles in front of me, to see old friends, to see new friends, to see former students, to see people who have broken ground repeatedly in African feminist work, thinking, scholarship, leadership, ways of building community, people certainly without whom the center and certainly my chair would not be possible. So I am thrilled to have all of you with us. I don't want to spend too much time talking about how happy I am, because I could literally talk about how happy I am for the next 3 hours, but I don't think you came to hear that. I'm also very excited to be talking to Lihle Ngcobozi about her debut book, and which is a remarkable book. Sfokazi Tao has already introduced Lihle to you. A little known, so let me start by embarrassing her a little bit. What was interesting, the first time I met Lihle, she was in fact my discussant at the very first public appearance of Rape: A South African Nightmare. I don't know if she knew that that was the very first event for Rape: A South African Nightmare. And she was then a graduate student at working on this project. I didn't know what she was working on at the time. And she gave an incredibly careful, detailed, generous reading of that text. And so it is with enormous joy and pleasure that I hope to return the favor somewhat. Although I must say that this amazing book is one that I have absolutely reveled in reading and thinking with and thinking through. So those of you who've joined us today can see just how many times and how read and reread this book is. So welcome, Lihle. I am so excited to talk to you about Mothers of the Nation, Manyano women in South Africa.
Hi, Prof. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm equally excited. And yeah, I think that was the first time we met. I was nervous. I'm nervous still, but I'm excited.
Okay, so let's get right to it. So I picked up the book for various reasons, and so one of the, and as I've already said, I find it's an example of such fine scholarship and such an incredible teaching moment. I mean, I learned so much. The figure of the Manyano woman, individually or as a community, is a very familiar sight in South African life, right? We see them in different dresses, in different places, in predominantly the Manyano woman in the black skirt and the red but also to a lesser extent from the Methodist Church, but to a lesser extent we see some of the Anglican and Catholic in the purple, but certainly the sight is a familiar one in South African life, and so in some ways it's hard to kind of imagine South African kind of moving through South African streets and valleys and so on without seeing them, and yet in many ways there is so much to know, to understand, to appreciate, to kind of analyze about Manyano life and culture and intervention. And so thank you very much for this book. That's what I want to say to start with. And I think you do so in very layered ways, in ways that kind of, I mean, I know you're a political scientist. It reads also very much, it definitely reads like a political scientist, but it reads like a sociology. It read very much like a cultural studies kind of book. It read like a public culture book. So it was incredibly joyful in how eloquently you position your arguments about how we should think about Manyano women or Mama Bonya Manyano in this text. So my first question then is perhaps about the initial way in which you approach your kind of the text of your study or the field of your study, right? I think if you had said to me, well, we're going to write a book on Manyano woman, it would have just been kind of a baffling how do you even start to study Omama Bomanyan, right? It's they're both everywhere. Where do you start? How do you make those decisions about how do you make those initial decisions?
Thank you, Prof. To be honest, I was very intimidated when I started, just because I understood how much a cultural reverence and the position that Omama Bobanyano occupies specifically for Black people and Black communities. And so I was very, very nervous. And I was also mindful that if I get it wrong, I could get it exponentially wrong. And if I get it right, I could get it right. And I didn't think there could be a happy medium between, you know, how I interpreted what was going on with them. And so my approach then was just to write it from the standpoint of, what did I see my grandmother doing? How did I see my grandmother's involvement within Omama Bobanyano? How did I see or interpret how it made her feel, how the community around her showed up for her in particular moments throughout her life, from the time that I was young, right up until now, until my adulthood, and still now in her sort of senior age, if we could call it that. And so in writing this, even the way that I started the book, in the opening sort of 2 pages and a half, that I really wanted to locate it within my own experience and within my family, and to show that in as much as later on in the book I make a lot of theoretical arguments, or try to build a lot of theoretical arguments, the fundamental positioning of Manyano woman is very, very personal for a lot of us, for myself, for a lot of us on the Zoom, and also the way that we see them on the streets on a Sunday, on a Thursday. None of us can actually just say we've never heard of this group of women. But my preoccupation beyond just the personal was also around the very, the misinterpretations of how they go about this Manyano thing, if I could call it that. On the one end, you know, the argument is that this is deeply conservative, this is deeply patriarchal, there's nothing about this group of women that can give us any offering politically, sociologically, historically, and they're just a group of women that are really just part and parcel of the church and the patriarchal ordering of womanhood and the conservative Christianity around how women are supposed to act within the church. And then on the one hand, at least that's where on the other hand, where I position myself is that there's so many interesting things that are happening here, politically, economically, socio-politically, historically, and not just historically in terms of liberation struggles, but as a standalone institution outside of dominant narrative of liberation ethics in South Africa. What do they offer us as an institution that we can look at as a standalone, without always having to sort of rope them into the grander liberation history in South Africa? And so that's what I wanted to find from a more intellectual perspective, to find out, what do they do? Why do they do what they do? And how can they offer us different interpretations of things that I think a lot of scholars write off and a lot of scholars deem as anti-feminist, anti-woman, anti, all of those things. But I wanted to find out what are the kind of arguments that we can make, not to convince people, but to show a different perspective that also allows us to see our parents and our grandmothers and our mothers in a very different way. And so also because throughout my undergrad, I wasn't really exposed to a lot of Black feminist work. I think I only came to sort of my first Black feminist literature probably in my honors year. And so when I discovered that, I realized that what I'd learned, or rather white feminist discourse, really didn't give me the tools to be able to understand this in a way that would be quite impactful. And so the journey then began, I think, from there to then decide in what ways, and the tools that I have now, how can I offer a different picture or a different perspective to the one that, you know, we dominantly hold as seeing them as inherently traditional or conservative.
Fantastic. So let's get to some of the things that you say then. So you argue that you show that it's not enough to think about Manyano women as part of thinking about religion, religious community, and spiritual community. It's not enough to think about, although of course they certainly are and an important part of that landscape. It's important to think about Manyano women and the work that they do in each generation as well as across generations, as through the language, through the lens of thinking, of imagining and of articulating institution, right? So you argue that we have to think about them as through the lens of institution building of themselves, Umanyano as an institution, not Umanyano as women who are part of a pre-existing institution, who simply are kind of an add-on or an adaptation. But then we need to think about the existence in terms of a key space of making sense of a range of intersecting and overlapping concerns. That we have to think about Umanyano women is to think about what does it mean to recognize that they are not just the largest organization of African women in our country or of Black women in our country, but to recognize that they are also an enduring institution of built by and for and through languages by and for African women. That we have to think about them as a very particular and difficult engagement with femininity, right? That a very, very complex engagement with a whole range of femininities. That in fact, and this is your second start after kind of locating yourself in the book, you say that we need to get, in order to get the public within which Manyano women make sense, we have to get a few things right. We have to free ourselves of many ways in which we think about public life. When we think about shared community, we have to think about this entity and citizenship and kind of, publicness, that many of the frameworks that we inherit from our scholarship, from kind of commonsensical, hegemonic sites and so on, are going to be inadequate. That you say on page 34, although, okay, it says, sorry, let me just read it quickly because I just absolutely, you say, although literature is sparse on the Black counter-public in South Africa, I argue that the Manyano can be located within two understandings of publicness in post-colonial and post-apartheid times, within the bifurcated nature of Africa as a whole and the bifurcated South African state. And of course you say as explained by. So part of what you're saying there then is that it's important for various, and this invitation and this challenge you offer, that you have to have the right understanding of how publicness works and what a Black public is, not just a counter public, what a Black public is and how it's constructed, how it's reconstructed, how it's contested, how it's imagined across different epochs. And if you don't get that right, then you can only continue to misread what Manyano women do and how they make this public. It's important for various arguments in your later chapters, this challenge of understanding what publics we mean, how they work and are constituted, and the capacity of visibility and kind of how we understand them. And in order to do so, of course, you have to tell us how to think about Black counterpublics, not counterpublics, to think about Black publics in very particular ways as part of the context of Umanyano, but also as part of what Umanyano women individually and collectively create. Do you want to say a little bit? Does that feel like I hope that doesn't feel like a misrepresentation.
No, not at all. I think it was also very complicated for me to actually think through as well at that time, because on the one hand, you know, you have the father of public sphere literature, I guess, if we could call it that, Habermas, you know, who paints this picture of a public sphere that is theoretical, but not necessarily real. And it's something that, you know, it's a conceptual framing of how public life is meant to work. But further on down the line, you really see the tangible ways in which his conception plays out in society and how it plays out in public life, and how then the life between what he calls, you know, the area of social reproduction versus the area of the economy, which he doesn't explicitly name in gendered ways, but we all know he's not brave enough to say that he's actually making quite gendered claims on who occupies particular spaces in what the public sphere, and beyond that, different allocations of power that are given or not given within these particular spheres. And further on to that is the claim that he tries to make that there really is no linkage in material terms between, you know, this social reproductive world and then this world in which the economy or the economic market works, right? And so my contestation is that it just didn't feel right in just leaving it there to say there's a public and a private sphere, and these spheres are particularly gendered, and because they are gendered in particular ways, the power allocations as well are gendered, and then people operate particularly from those vantage points. And it just didn't fit for me. It just felt very white and very, very European, because it also, Habermas's way of formulating the public and private spheres also didn't account for how the European conception of the public was very divorced from Black people being able to participate in this public sphere. And it wasn't also taking into cognizance of the ways in which imperialization and imperial colonialism was also at the same time constituting this particular sphere that Habermas is speaking of. And so to really create a sphere that is seemingly abstract, but has very material and real consequences, not only for Western European countries, but also for later on in the project of colonization and resource extraction and all of that, it had quite material conditions for the way that we believe women engage in politics of the African continent as well. And how then it arranged, through colonialism, what the public sphere then did, or that concept of it, was that it erased the very life-sustaining social arrangements that were part and parcel of African social organizing at that time. And so the introduction of that particular public sphere, not just only in literature and in conceptualization, but also in the material ways in which it was executed by colonial powers and colonial administrators, not just only in European countries, but in Africa as a whole, had serious implications then of how then we will 10, 15, 16, 100 years down the line, understand this idea of what a public sphere is. And so for me then to then make use of that theoretical framing as a way to understand publicness, counter-publicness, and the different interpretations of it, but also the different ways in which women participate within those particular spheres, it just wasn't enough to make use of that as the sole theoretical frame. So you'll see in the book that I really wanted to then take everyone on a journey to say, this is what we know of a public sphere, this is what has been fundamentally presented. But we also know that with the colonial period, we experienced quite a lot of bifurcation in many ways, whether it's economically, socio-politically, geographically, but that also had implications then on how that bifurcation works in the way in which people participate in politics. And so because of that bifurcation, we can't then contain that there's a hegemonic public which all citizens are able to occupy, and all citizens are able then to interact politically or at an interpersonal level on the same way or on the same terrain. And so to problematize that for me is very important, because it also gives us a different way then of reading how people are positioned within these publics, whether they are counter publics, subaltern publics, alternative publics, whatever way you want to characterize them. It gives us also a different way of how then those social categories of whether it's woman, man, Black, white, how they also differ in operation within these different spheres. And so once we don't do that theoretical background, that background or contextual work, we really do miss a lot of what is happening. And beyond that, we mischaracterize and misrecognize a lot of the interesting things that happen within the complexities and within the nuances that we then find when we problematize a lot of universal characterizations as public, counter-public, and so on. And so through my wanting to understand what a public sphere actually means, it really required me to go back historically, how they politically, but then beyond that, how it also works socio-politically, specifically in racialized, class, and gendered societies like our own. And looking at the Manyano group specifically, I think that really, for me, was an eye-opener to be able then to unravel a lot of the theoretical baggage that a lot of Western scholarship attaches to institutions such as this. And so once you're able to do that, you're then able to just uncover a bit more than what you would be ordinarily uncovering if you really stuck to that particular characterization or that train of thought.
So one of the things that set off fireworks in my head, there were several, so one of the things that I find incredibly irritating as a South African feminist, as a Black woman who's a feminist in this country, is the often circulated claim that I feel just parades to be some kind of radical critique, but is actually incredibly dangerous. It's often circulated claim that Black people who are appropriately located in relation to coloniality and pride and African pasts don't have time for Christianity, that there's something automatically backward and self-hating about Africans who find like, really, this is how your ancestors were killed. So if you have any kind of time and engagement with a religious community that indexes Christianity, you're just a self-hating person who needs to do your own work, right? You've heard this, and it's at some point it gets really amplified, and it's like, well, if you proper Blackness is only spiritual in terms of spiritual traditions that index either the continent in supposedly unproblematic ways around retrieval and so on, that's or other world religions that don't go via Europe in the same kinds of ways. And I feel like in some ways, part of reading this book and the ways in which you pay attention to the kind of how complicated the work of building Manyano women as an institutional, the institutional reading, the deep reading of its structure, of its working, of its speaks so powerfully against. It's not a response to this kind of what I often feel is a misguided and dangerous assertion. It's because it doesn't even deal with it, right? But it's such a clear testimony maybe to how invalid that is. So I thought you did this particularly well in relation to two specific to the following things. So when you talk about home, right, and you talk about the ways in which Manyano women are a site of, I suppose in academic terms, we might think a site of imagining and theorizing the possibility, the radical possibility of a home for Black people that is impossible under coloniality, that is deliberately under attack, under colonialism, under apartheid. So whether you're talking about a range of things, including the deliberate breaking apart of black families, Manyano give us a spectacular example of a reimagining of what a home and what community look like, and with all the attendant benefits that come from building a home, and maybe some of the difficulties as well. So in the world of ritual, in the world of the affect, in the world of all of these things. And so it gives us a sense to think about family, to think about community, not to just think about it. It creates a model and the possibility of home, of family, of freedom that are not indebted or just responding to the logic and the onslaught of kind of white supremacist patriarchy that is apartheid and colonialism, but is a really, really creative and imaginative response to that onslaught on black entitlement to home and family, and reimagines what community could look like with all the implications of care and love and organization and structure and so on. And of course, you do this so beautifully when you talk about also the socialization into Mañano-ness as a child. So it seems to me there's like a braided narrative. There's this kind of exquisite theorizing of how exactly Mañano creates home and community and structure and all of these things, and not as a counter, but just as an unapologetic kind of presence and imagination, at the same time as this kind of staging almost of this little child's socialization into this world, with the curiosity and with the mystery and the romance and the conflictedness and the distance and the proximity and all of those things. Do you want to say a little bit about some of that?
Yeah, I think the home thing is complicated because we all know home is not always nice. Like home has its weird dynamics. There's drunk uncle there. There's auntie that always just says whatever she wants. But at the same time, it's familiarity, and it's a place that, whether it has its issues, it's still home at the end of the day. But the point on sort of Mañano as a site of imagining, as we, this discourse around, church is a colonial concept, which is fine. Like, sure, you can have that argument, right? But for me, the fact that the cultural reverence and the cultural resonance that this particular institution has for all of us, despite our misgivings around the church and our ideological differences around, Christianity came on a boat, as the argument goes, despite all of those complications, the cultural reverence of this institution still holds a lot of weight within our communities. And I think I speak a bit sort of around the different rituals of care, specifically around death. And the different rituals the significance that particular rituals have because of the presence of this particular group of women. You can't deny or escape that. And there is no way that we can, have this conversation if we're not actually going to be honest about the fact that we do buy into this institution. We fundamentally believe in it because in some ways it is a community that is offered that doesn't necessarily require us to barter with our identities in many ways. It doesn't require us to make particular compromises for us to engage with each other. It doesn't require us to strip parts of our identity for us to be accepted into this particular community in some ways. And so if you look at the rituals of death specifically, that sense of having, from the time that somebody passes away, and you can call Umamuspanban, whether you go to that church or not, whether they know you, but the fact that they knew your mom or that you're part of that community, you'll know that within the next couple of hours, somebody's going to be there. And then the whole week starts and all of that. And so this idea of a home, for me, is quite instructive because it also links politically that the church has been fundamentally a broad-based political organization, whether we like it or not, through its infusion of liberation theology, and how it infused with redemptive politics around equality, and the different ways in which we think through who has the right to be saved and who has the right to be seen as a human being. The broad-based nature of the particular church has been fundamentally around a political home for a lot of South Africans, which also then doesn't surprise us that in the post-apartheid moment, you also have the state leaning into this institutions for a number of reasons. Where that leaning into is whether leaning into it is for political gain, whether it serves a particular interest, the iconography and imagery of political parties being incorporated into a church structure still holds a lot of cultural and political reference for a lot of us. And so the church is a home in that particular sense. But also beyond that, the idea of Manyano woman network of care or network of support around affect, or what Melissa Harris Perry calls fictive kinship. It's this idea that there is a network of people that these women rely on, that there's a kinship that is established between them that isn't ordinarily established outside of the church, or isn't ordinarily established within a racialized, classed, and highly gendered South Africa. And so if you're not able to ordinarily experience particular moments of kinship, security, economic, food security as well, whatever forms of social security that you won't ordinarily find within the state, you can find it within this particular community or within this particular kinship that is developed between these women. And so home becomes way more than just a space of affect, but it also does become a financial resource. It becomes a spiritual resource. And, throughout the moments of liberation struggles in South Africa, it also becomes a political resource in which you devise strategies of survival. You also devise strategies of political interactions with the state, but also you find ways of ensuring that how are resources distributed in a way that ensures the survival of a community, which is significantly under a lot of constrained violence by the apartheid state. And so that those workings of the institution go beyond just this idea that this is an imported institution that really has no political organizing going on, and that it's just a bunch of women who have been brainwashed into thinking that Christianity is the end all and be all. But the different ways in which we, even as people that critique this institution, we still find a lot of resources that we want to use within that very institution as well. And so we also need to be a bit honest in our critique of it, because if, for example, no Umama Manyano doesn't show up at your funeral, at your mother's funeral, you're going to feel some type of way about that. And so you need to be honest about that. And so for me, it's really also understanding the different networks of fictive kinship that exist within Black communities, which most of the time have a lot of spiritual and religious connotations to them. And so whether you want to subscribe to that or not, and I think that's the thing that you have to think through on your own, but to automatically assume that this institution is not inward looking and it has no Africanness to it is a little misleading for me. And I think it's a bit lazy to just paint it in that way.
I absolutely agree, and I think that, in fact, one of the biggest contributions of your study are the many implications it has. Yes, for the field of its focus, but also for allied areas of thinking. It makes it really difficult to think about the meeting places of Blackness and publics, of femininities and politics. So, for example, one of the things that we always talking about, and one of the things that you even within feminist scholarship and mobilization and within South Africa, one of the issues and areas that remains contentious is how to think about political motherhood, how to think about motherhood, how to think about Black motherhood, how to think about Black femininity in relation to publics, in relation to the political. And part of what you say is actually part of what's missing from this, part of what continues to niggle us, cannot fully be engaged without also taking seriously the ways in which motherhood is processed in various kind of institutions built by women, such as Umanyano. And so I found that incredibly powerful. This idea that what you do, the definitions and the layers of definitions of motherhood as part of entry and as part of kind of the specific rituals of Manyano. And also, I mean, that wonderful kind of discussion of ubufazi, which of course, if you're a Nguni speaker, you know that this, to say umfazi is both one thing and very different things across the Nguni languages, right? So like just the word itself sometimes it carries ambiguities across. And so this wonderful thing that you talk about how, actually Manyano women are able to process it in ways that allow the identities of Umufazi, the locations of Umufazi, of the subjecthood of Umfazi or motherhood to not just be problems, not to remain problems, but to remain things that can be worked with as part of, as meaning different things in the negotiation of belonging. And of course, also that wonderful analysis that you have, not just of motherhood generally, but of political motherhood, and where you bring together political motherhood, the mothers of the nation as Omayano women, and of course the mother of the nation in the political sense. And you think and to think about, well, what happens when we think about the fact that, yes, Winnie Mandela, for example, on her death is, I mean, we knew when she was alive that she was a Manyano woman. There was no secret about this. She performed this quite, she wore her uniform several, like openly. So, I mean, but this sense of bringing those two big meanings then of mother of the nation together, not as competition, but what does it mean to think about the mother of the nation when we also recognizing that to be mother of, these are the mothers of the nation, there's this meaning too to political motherhood and collective motherhood and public motherhood. So I'm going to ask you to comment on that, but I'm also going to ask for her, maybe read out an earlier question from Simamgele as we wrap up. So maybe you can answer me and you can answer this one question. So Simamgele in the chat says, loving this conversation already. And I love how you center your grandmother in the book, Lishe, as well as the Manyano women she is in community with. Can you please share how the book was received by her and the other women you engage in conversations with?
Sure. Let me start on the first one. The motherhood thing for me, it's still, every time I talk about this book, it's still like a hot potato. And I'm not sure why. I'm still struggling to understand, why is this such a, like, why is it getting everyone so hot and bothered, and why are we insisting on an either or understanding of this thing, specifically around motherhood either being used as a springboard into other political arenas of life or contestations of power, or motherhood being seen as such a conservative social identity that, you can't make use of, for political gains because, you're buying into the patriarchy, And so for me, it really was a non-question because of the way that I saw my gran never disempowered because she was a mother, and never and motherhood for her, at least not in our home, not being used as something that is particularly jarring, or something that is just so fragile that we have to tiptoe around. Are you a mother? Are you this? Or you're that? And so when I got into the literature around the different debates around whether or not motherhood is, seen as a tool for people to enter into politics, or whether a social identity that allows them women to make use of it to enter into other forms of identity politics, I I fell within sort of that line of argument between Deborah Gateskill and Untitled, if I'm not mistaken, around if you're wanting to think about the constitution of Black motherhood in South Africa, there's no way that you can think about it divorced of history and divorced of race, divorced of class, divorced of all the other social systemic issues that in many ways compromise Black women's ability to mother. And so once the state encroaches on Black women's ability to mother, how then do you expect them to respond when they are contesting that state's encroachment? So do you want them to respond not as mothers, or do you I wasn't understanding, what kind of response are you expecting for mothers when the very nature of their ability to mother is being encroached upon by the state? And so the iconography for me of political mother made far more sense to say, sure, Black women are organizing in their own right as individuals, but the nature of motherhood is a position of seniority that holds social capital within Black communities and is quite a communal understanding of mama as a whole. It only made sense that they would make use of that particular resource to agitate against a violent state, or to find ways to contest the power of an apartheid state that was encroaching on the very private sphere where Black women feel particularly entitled to protect. You disagree with it or not, but that is the space in which they wish to occupy. And so for me, the political iconography of motherhood, taking into consideration race and taking into consideration how the state fundamentally created conditions in which motherhood really was probably one of the entry points in which women decided to make use of, to contest the state. For me, it doesn't read as sort of a selling out or a patriarchal understanding of women's political participation. If anything, it just tells me that women are able to make use of their social identities in ways that they can make gains or make particular claims to the state, whether that's an apartheid state or a post-apartheid state. They're able to make use of that particular subjectivity to make particular gains. And whether we agree with that as feminist scholars, I don't think it's a determination that requires us to validate. Because that's how people often feel that they want to express themselves. But what we should problematize, though, is the different ways in which then people make use of motherhood for their own understandings of how power is supposed to work in society. So how men, for example, characterize motherhood and how then that plays out politically and how that plays out within the state and also how that plays out within institutions, whether it's institutions of higher learning, whatever social institutions that we're a part of. And so the problem doesn't become mothers. The problem then becomes how you interpret and you allocate or take away particular powers in your understanding of motherhood, because you're not able to think through the layered dimensions of what mothering and motherhood looks like beyond just the biology of it, but the social and the socioeconomic and the social cultural reverence that we as people see and umama or mama in whatever way that you want to conceive of it. So for me, it's I think it's a non-question, but a lot of feminists find it to be a very serious debate, but of which I can appreciate. Seema asked about how, first of all, my grandmother was very, and I always say that I wouldn't have been able to write this book without my grand, because she was my informant, or I guess that's what people call that, but she was my co-collaborator, which is what I call her. I don't think I would have been able to have access to the woman that I had access to. She went with me to all my interviews. She helped me translate some things. She was very critical in writing this book and also in the thesis as well. And so she was very critical, and I was very mindful as well of making sure that the women who are part of this book are centered, and that I try very, and you also see the chunks of transcriptions that are in the book, because I wanted them to have their voice, and I wanted that to be quite pronounced in the book. And so when they received their copies of the book, most of them were very, very pleased. And I also think that most of them also didn't understand what was the big hoo-ha around them. For themselves, it's just, we just go to church, man, and that's that. And there's nothing beyond that, and so when I explained to them, what I was thinking through and what I was writing and what I was saying about them, a lot of them were just like, yeah, you're actually right. That's exactly what we're doing. And so I also realized that they really didn't need me to validate their experiences about their organization. If anything, I was just somebody that was just illuminating things that a lot of us probably aren't aware of. But yeah, they're very, very much, they enjoyed the book. And I think one particular woman, Stella Shumbe, who was also very critical here. She actually, she read the book and she wrote a very long review about it and, highlighted things that I got wrong and things that I got right. So it really wasn't something that I did alone. And I don't think I can ever overemphasize that it was a collaborative project more than it was just about me. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Okay. Unfortunately, even though I could talk to you for 2 days about this book, I have like 10 more questions, which of course I'm never going to get to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read all the questions in the chat, and maybe as a way of wrapping up, I'll let you have the final word before we hand over to the next person. I'm going to read them. So Lee Walters says, and you don't have to answer all of them, just do what you choose. Thank you, Lihle, and congratulations. I look forward to reading your book. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about the institutional formation, particularly about women's economic systems or ways of doing finance? Kollega Shange says, Lihle, siyabonga kakhulu for writing this. Such a beautiful book. I'm struck by the manner in which you center visuality in your writing. Firstly, your use of Andile Bala's photographic work is incredible. Looking at the aesthetic of your book, I can't, wait, sorry. What did I do? Sorry. Looking at the aesthetic of your book, I can't help but think of Mabato Munso's paintings that represent Manyano women. Secondly, the way you usher the reader into your writing via photographic portraiture is something I really appreciate, especially because you're an academic who's not in the discipline of the visual arts. Siyabonga for taking images seriously to theorize about them. I also love how you theorize about room divider. Man, I could go on and on, Siyabonga. Neo Masabane says, thank you, Lihle. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I absolutely agree. Although we cannot deny the existence of patriarchal institutions, but using that as a point of departure in our arguments, we sometimes miss so much. In terms of how women in Africa construct an agency within those spaces. But if we theorize from the ground up, we get to learn a lot about womanhoods and women's agency in Africa. And Baba Lama Kokwana, my director, says, thanks, Lihle. We appreciate this intervention centering our mothers and grandmothers. Please speak more about the Manyano women you interviewed, about how they say this institution has changed, especially regarding ukubekezela of this new generation of Manyano women. And I'm going to let you have the final word, but I also just want to thank you again for this conversation. Thank you again for commandeering and keeping since the book came out, a part of my brain permanently and leaking into a whole range of other projects that I'm working on. Thank you very much for an incredibly incisive and generative piece of African feminist work. I'm going to let you have the last word.
Thanks, Prof. I think I'll start with the colleague. So I think when the book, or even when I was doing the master's, Umanta was doing those paintings, and I found them very, very interesting. I think it also sparked a lot of interest, and not only the master's, but also developing this further for the book. And part of why, and a lot of critique that I get about the book is that, why did you use a man photographer? And I had reached out to Amanda, but unfortunately, she was very busy and couldn't help out. And I found Andile on Instagram, actually, and he had a series called The Sunday People. And his photography was really just capturing Black people on a Sunday in just their ordinary church get-up, whether it's, on their way to church, coming back from church, gathered in Manzini or gathered by a field. And I really found the candid nature of those particular pictures to be very moving, just to say, although this group of women are spectacular, it's also very everyday. Even in the cover, you see, there's a school kid there, somebody's waiting for a taxi, somebody's listening to their music on their earphones. It's just a very ordinary, everyday picture that when you see it, it's not particularly profound because it's part of the everyday, but also it's very, very spectacular when we begin to think about what this group of women represent culturally. And so I really was careful in making sure that the pictures that I use, and even the framings that I use in writing, particular moments, whether it's my gran and I, driving up to the church, meeting the grandmother, grandchild, all of these I wanted to be very, very vivid, because I think we all are very, very much used to those particular memories, whether as children or as adults. And so I really took the visual part of it very, very seriously. I think there was a question around economic systems and ways of doing finance. So I think we all know Stokfela have been around since forever. A lot of Stokfela now as well. Also use that as a financial system that we tap into, whether it's around burial societies or whether it's around, umgalelo for groceries or for Christmas, whatever the case may be. So those institutions of umanyano or women's groups in general are far more complex beyond just women coming together, but they also have particular resources, whether it's through the Stokvels, whether it's through, burial societies, whether it's through, kitchen, Tupperware saving, whatever the case may be. All of these play a very significant role in how resources are generated and how then they are distributed within that particular community or that particular group of women. I don't think initially the Manyano set out to have a or economic component to them. I think it also just happened as a byproduct of the times and the different financial strain, especially for women who are, coming into the urban areas sort of with the migrant labor system, and sort of that economic support that they generated amongst themselves really created ways in which they can share and distribute resources, specifically when they were in moments of dire constraint. And so I think it's still part and parcel of the Manyano group right now, but most importantly, which I think is a project that anybody can take on, is around the burial societies and the economic arrangements around that, and how women sort of make use of that in very interesting ways. And so the last question before I take too much time is Dr. Makokana asked about Ubegezela. Yeah, so this one is also very tricky because we're in this day and age now of like, red flag and come out. Not just in romantic relationships, but just in any situation. Once you see a red flag, and sekola. But so Ubegezela, I think I'm also finding it very difficult to think through that, because personally I'm just not umbegezeli. But the ways in which my Manyano women really find umbegezela as a tool of survival and a strategy for survival, not just in terms of relationships, whatever the case may be, that we know it now in sort of cultural Twitter discourse, but umbegezela really under dire constraints of life, and how they make use of that umbegezela really as a way for them to be able to navigate the precarity they find themselves in. And umbegezela isn't necessarily just about holding on, but it's like being able to persevere and to also make use of the resources around you while you are, in that moment of precarity. And how big umbegezela also is infused with a lot of spiritual elements to it, holding on, persevering, waiting on God, being led by the Spirit, and all of those things. And I think that the only way a lot of them actually do survive, especially the women that I interviewed, a lot of them survive off of that umbegezela in the spiritual sense, and being able to endure, being able to persist, and being able to lean into religion and umbegezela in instances where the state has failed them, and where the state has failed to create that economic buffer for them not to be under such dire economic constraints. And so most of them say that the Manyano women of today really don't know what ubegezela is, or they don't really lean into that, because again, once you see a red flag, you're out. And, once at the first sign of distress, we tend to give up. And their characterization was very disparaging, if I'm being honest, to say, a lot of us are very weak, we're not strong, we're not, we don't take it on the chin anymore, and we don't make use of resources around us to be able to persevere in moments of struggle. And so most of them really fundamentally just don't think that we're strong. And I think we can have another conversation on Black strength and womanhood, and how that conversation has changed now with the introduction of, I'm not a strong woman. But for them, they really prioritize that. And I think if that is how they make sense of their world and their precarity, I think I just give them this space to do that, to begezela,
Thank you, Lihle. I think that's it. Thank you very much. There are more comments, mostly expressing gratitude and congratulations, but I'll trust you to read those. I'm going to hand over back to Spokas. Thank you so much, Lihle, again.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much, Lihle. Just to echo also just some of the positive comments that are coming into the chat section. And thank you so much, Prof. Gola, for engaging, for that level of engagement as well with Lihle's work. I'm just going to introduce the next authors who will be in conversation with Gail Smith. And by way of just getting them ready to get on the platform for us, I'm going to read just some brief bios of the editors of Surfacing on Being Black and Feminist in South Africa. I'm going to start with Prof. Desiree Lewis, who has published on the politics of South Africa and global feminism from a Black perspective since the early 1990s. Her recent work focuses on the neoliberalism in relation to feminism, as well as feminism and food as material culture. The author of Living on a Horizon, Bessie Head and the Politics of Imagining, she has guest edited special issues of feminist journals, including Feminist Africa and Agenda, and has served on the editorial boards of Australian Feminist Studies and Feminist Africa, as well as other interdisciplinary journals. Prof. Lewis began her teaching and writing career as a literary scholar, but now teaches, writes, and thinks in transdisciplinary ways that involve seeking to reanimate knowledge-making in the academy. As a feminist academic and intellectual activist, she is passionate about radical knowledge-making and creative expression that transcends academic and generic conventions. The co-editor, Prof. Khabeba Badaroon, is a poet and scholar. She is the author of poetry collections, The Dream in the Next Body, 100 Silences and the History of Intimacy, as well as the monograph regarding Muslims from slavery to post-apartheid. Her work has received the Daimler Prize for South African Poetry, the Elizabeth Ebers Poetry Prize, the University of Johannesburg Prize for South African Writing, and 2 Best Book Awards from the National Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. Prof. Badaroon is also an editor. She has edited collections of poetry by Bandile Gumbi, Epiphany Mukasano, Natalia Mulebadzi, and Philippa Ya de Villiers, amongst others. Prof. Badaroon is a member of the editorial board of the African Poetry Book Fund, which has published over 70 collections by African poets since 2012. In 2021, with Desiree Lewis, Badaroon co-edited the Germinal essay collection, Surfacing on Being Black and Feminist in South Africa. She has received writing fellowships from the Nordic Africa Institute and at the University of Witwatersrand, the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study, and the Rockefeller Center for Bellagio. At Bellagio, sorry. All right, she is currently an associate professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies and African studies at Pennsylvania State University, where she co-directs the African Feminist Initiative. And then lastly, Gail Smith, who will lead the conversation with the two editors and authors. Gail Smith is a feminist writer, journalist, and media strategist. Her publications include both journalism and long-form essays on race, on gender, feminism, and culture. And she has written extensively on Winnie Mandela. Gail's TV credits include A Feminist Thing from 2020, South Africa's first unapologetically feminist talk show, as well as research and writing on the life and times of Sarah Baartman from 1998, and the return of Sarah Baartman in 2002, for which she documented the historic return of Sarah Baartman. Gail Smith is also a Neiman Fellow at Harvard. She is also the former spokesperson of the South African Human Rights Commission and a former senior specialist writer for City Press, as well as the former head of the UNISA Institute for Gender Studies. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome to the platform Gail Smith, Professor Lewis, and Professor Badaru.
Hello.
Thank you so much, Sibokazi. Can you hear me? I hope I'm audible.
Yes,
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. As Sibokazi said, my name is Gail Smith. I'm a journalist and a feminist writer, and I am beyond delighted to be here today. I have the pleasure of discussing this incredible collection surfacing on being Black and feminist in South Africa. This book speaks directly to the theme of this event. It is almost a direct response, and I'm absolutely delighted to have been invited here, not least because I get to speak to two incredible writers and thinkers who have been very, very instrumental in my own development as a thinker and as a writer. And so without any further ado, I do want to introduce them because I really want to just kick off and get into the meat of it. So the editors of this collection are Desiree Lewis, who is a professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of the Western Cape, and Habiba Badaroon, who is a literary scholar, poet, and associate professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Pennsylvania State University. Desiree and Habiba, are you there? I hope you are there. I think that for me, this book just totally syncs and ties in with the theme of today, which really is a celebration of feminist heritage. And I think that as a feminist and somebody who's been a feminist for a long time, I am beyond grateful to have this collection in hand, because I think it's so long overdue. Just a little bit of background on not just myself, but the two thinkers that I'm going to be engaging with today. When I was doing my own master's and really wrestling with myself as a feminist and feminist theory, this was in 1995. The internet didn't exist. Well, it had just started. So there was nothing online available at the time. And the work of Habiba Badaroon and the work of Desiree Lewis and the work of other feminists who had come before me were absolutely important and instrumental to me. And I think this ties into the celebration of a feminist heritage, building on notions, work that sits at the intersections of gender, memory, and creativity. And this book is a very powerful insertion of Black feminist thought, not only into heritage, but into memory. So I want to welcome, I can't see Habiba and Desiree, but I think I had to make some very difficult decisions with the book, The collection is absolutely, absolutely phenomenal. But the collection is also a very powerful editorial comment. And so as a journalist, I was really torn between, do I focus on the content and the phenomenal array of essays, or do I speak to the editors about the editorial choices they made, which are so profound? So my job here today is really to look at this book and to see what do the essays reveal about Black feminist locations in South Africa? What are the aesthetic choices of the editors and the writers? And how does this book complicate the intersections of race and gender? And this book does all of that in incredible ways. And I really want to just jump straight into it with the editors, with Desiree. And also just to say to both Desiree and Habiba, just, I don't think you ever appreciate or understand how much a part of feminist heritage you are in this country, along with Pumla and Shireen Hassim. And Habiba, your and Pumla's work on memory has been incredibly groundbreaking. And I really, really, really am delighted to be participating in this with all of you, because you are the feminist forerunners that this book certainly seeks to surface. And that's why it's called Surfacing. It's not just surfacing current feminist intellectual work, but also past. So the book starts with a very, very confrontational editorial note. And I just I'm going to start with a question, I suppose, first for you, Habiba. I've got a two-part question. So you start with quite a powerful editorial note. And as a journalist, this really struck me, because as a journalist, you really, really understand when you work in a newsroom, the power of the editors and the power of the people who hold those editorial decisions. And so you say right at the outset, right at the beginning of the book, you say, surfacing on being Black and feminist in South Africa features the usage of Black, white, and colored with uppercase initial letters in some chapters. This reflects the political choices of the authors in whose chapters they feature. In other chapters, Black, white, and colored remain lowercase, a style choice adopted by Wits University Press. Similarly, some chapters feature words and concepts from languages and histories outside of the English language. Translations and explanations appear for these words and phrases where absolutely necessary, with the respective author's permission. In other chapters, we have respected authors' political preferences not to translate Indigenous African language words and phrases. I think that's a very, very powerful editorial statement to make right at the outset. So I guess, Habiba, my first question to you is, how did this complicate the process of editing this collection?
Thank you very much, Gail, for those beautiful words. And indeed, our long, long, long friendship has nourished me. And thank you for as well discussing this book with Desiree and me. And also to Professor Babalwa and Professor Pumla, thank you for crafting this festival, which I don't know exists anywhere else in the world. And it is really a bounty for us. Thank you for making it truly a festival. Gail, your question about the decisions we made that for some people might feel technical, for us felt central and grounding. We respected the authors firstly because they brought to us the central insights that this book is rich with. But we also brought to this the sense that there wasn't a center that was formed by English and that other languages would be othered. And we, especially in South Africa, and we even defined through the colleagues who wrote what South African meant in a totally new way, we certainly were not going to marginalize the insights that carried the path of other languages. So for us, that was far from a technical matter. And I didn't feel that it complicated editorial work at all. It, in fact, aligned very much with it, but it did mean that we had to have some conversations with Wits. And our commissioning editor, Roshan Kader, whose idea this book was, and I really pay tribute to her for that, they were receptive. We did have to have conversations and we did push boundaries, but I think it was a very good relationship ultimately with the press, and a totally beautiful relationship with the authors.
Thank you, Habiba. Desiree, are you there? I want to ask you about the editorial choice, because I think...
Definitely, yeah. I can see you.
Hi, hello. I wanted to ask you about the editorial choice, because I think it's right at the outset, you were acknowledging that language is ultimately, you know, about power. And so my question to you then, as one of the editors, did that editorial choice at any stage force you to confront your own power or powerlessness in relation to language in terms of your work as an editor on this collection?
I think most definitely. You know, being an editor does mean, of course, having a certain authority, a certain power, which is reflected simply in sort of having the power to select and decide. So apart from the language issue, there is that. But I think it's, for us, the question of language was thought about mainly in terms of what forms of expression constitute knowledge. You know, what has been the long legacy, the long tradition of radical knowledge making by South African women. And of course, these forms, there've been a variety of forms. And I think so often feminism is defined in relation to the academy, in relation to academic discourses, in relation to very particular registers. You speak a particular language, you invoke certain figures, and even when you seem to be speaking the language of subversion, you are anchoring yourself in this kind of core. So I think for us, language differences and the question of which language was prioritized or was not prioritized, or that we took a stand against prioritizing, was less significant than what I think we thought of as a bigger question, which relates to Habiba's point about having really difficult conversations with Wits, which was about what forms to use. And the personal essay form, which was the preferred form that we wanted and that most writers were comfortable about, is a disparaged form. You know, it's considered a medium simply to let your thoughts and feelings hang out. It's not associated with knowledge. So, I mean, that's a very long-winded way of approaching that question, because I haven't confronted my own position of power in relation to that. But I think the questions around power had a lot to do with what I've just raised here.
I'm glad you bring up the issue of the academic register. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I absolutely loved about this book, is that you're challenging so much, not just in the content, but the editorial choices and the way that you put it together. And as somebody who sits outside of the academy, wherever that means, I'm constantly frustrated by this idea that you as academics sit in some ivory tower and that's where you live. You know, and I think that for me in the collection very much addresses that sort of fake divide. And I want to ask you a bit then about the decisions that I know the answer to the question, by the way, just to say to the people that are watching this, in case they think, Lord, didn't she read the book? I've read it, and let me tell you something, it is not something you will read in a year, and you will come back to it. It will become one of those dog-eared collections. But now I've lost my train of thought, so let me just move on to the next question. I wanted to speak to you about this academic divide between the work that is done in the academy and the work that is done outside. How do you feel when you are presented with that sort of stereotype, which I think is actually very divisive, because it keeps us away from understanding the work that Black feminists do inside of the academy. And as somebody who sits on the outside, who's always, I love reading and I love ideas. And so for me, even as a journalist, the academy was often a very good source of stories and a good source of analysis. But there still is this really, really sticky notion that academics sit outside of society. And I think you tried very hard to break that divide in this book. So just perhaps you first, Desiree, do you still encounter this sort of ridiculous notion that as an academic, you're sitting in an ivory tower, kind of twiddling your thumbs and sucking on chicken bones?
Yeah, I do confront that, kind of assumption, and with reason, because in many ways, the academy is a space of privilege, and there are outrageous conventions, especially in the contemporary neoliberal academy, which make life there very weird. And the process of knowledge production is compromised by all kinds of problems. That what I find important is the way in which very often the assumption on the part of book marketers and book publishers is that actually Black feminists shouldn't be writing knowledge. They should just be expressing their experience. So for me, it's useful, rather than to talk about academic versus non-academic, to talk about the importance of knowledge and the different forms that knowledge take. A lot of academic work is, as far as I'm concerned, absolutely meaningless and boring and not new. But of course, it observes all the conventions. A lot of work that is considered to be not academic by Black women writers, that is very powerful, is defined as storytelling, as kind of, stream of consciousness, an insight into someone's life, rather than an interpretation, which is why there's been a long tradition of people interpreting Black women's knowledge, Black women's fiction, Black women's expression. And I think the challenge with this book, of course, this is not, there've been lots and lots of books by Black women, but one of the challenges that this book tried to deal with, and I think this was fairly novel, is to rethink the way in which different knowledge forms constitute knowledge by Black women. They do not have in turn to be interpreted by others, to be kind of revealed, misinterpreted, by the way, very often. So, for Ingrid Masondo to actually speak about artists and allow them also to speak was extremely important.
Thanks, Desiree. Habiba, I want to ask you a slightly different question, also related, I suppose, to the editorial choices and the rationale for this book. And the thing about this book is just that it's also so beautifully written. And that's really what I love. So I want to read little bits that just jumped out at me before I ask you the question, Habiba. But you speak about the need to avoid fixing Black feminist ways of seeing becomes clear when we acknowledge the global and regional diversity of Black feminisms. Black feminism has accrued meanings that are both wide-ranging and very particular. And then you say Black feminism in the global imaginary is often synonymous with African-American feminist thought. Now, I think that this collection is very, very overtly a response to that editorial domination, isn't it? I mean, I think that's really what jumped out at me, is that you really want to close that gap with this collection. And I suppose my question to you, Habiba, is how do you still confront that editorial domination being based at Pennsylvania in the United States? And to what extent are you able to bring in Southern African and African feminist intellectual work into the American Academy and break that sort of hegemony and domination?
Yes, thank you for identifying that place in the editorial, Gail, which I think is another place of confrontation where we identified an erasure, and surfacing contests several forms of erasure. the erasure of Southern African forms of feminist knowledge in the very powerful global conception of Black feminism is a real problem. It is also an ironic and hypocritical problem because South African figures feature as material in the writing of feminists who then become dominant figures. Now, this has very little to do with the actual scholars themselves and has to do with patterns of hegemony in the global marketplace, in textbooks, for instance, in what counts as knowledge globally, which is, of course, dominated by the North. So it certainly isn't that we are pointing fingers at particular authors who, for Desiree and me both, I know this because she has said it herself, have been really inspirations. Carol Boyce Davies, for instance, and Margaret Busby, among others, who have really made the effort to include and to close that gap that you identified. So my own position, wherever I am, at UCT or when I was at Wits briefly or elsewhere, and at Stellenbosch, which I currently have an honorary connection with, and definitely at Penn State, my identity as an African feminist and a South African feminist travels with me. My teaching on global feminism is actually quite heavily, heavily Southern African. Not because I'm from there, but because the most fascinating feminist conversations are possible when you assign these readings. For many of my students, yes, it may be an introduction, but once they are introduced to it, they start to cite, they start to read further. So, you know, what your question about the academy, it struck me truly as a misperception. One example, of course, is that the recent revolutionary movements in South Africa arose in the academy among students, but certainly inspired by some of the scholars and teachers like Pumla, like Amina Mama, and others, like Mary Hames as well. So the academy is a space of radical thought and radical change. When you make that change to insist on surfacing areas that have been erased or neglected, that has become a kind of habit, because there is a thing called African feminism, which is gaining some prominence in the North. And even that African feminism is weighted towards certain parts of the continent that become prominent in the North. So we want to correct both the absences in what counts as global feminism and what has counted as African feminism. Some people might say that South Africa is overrepresented in some parts of the world, and that too is an argument to be made if you're a Central African, if you're an East African, etc. I think, however, a pan-continental idea of African feminism is very necessary, and certainly the wealth and the riches of Southern African feminism belong there. And, you know, we just haven't had a book like this gathering South African feminism since the 1990s. And there's never been a book on Black South African feminism. So there was definitely the time for this conversation and for this book as one of many books to come, I hope.
Thank you, Habiba. And you've taken me to exactly the next part that I wanted to talk about, which is exactly the academy and the space that became this tinderboxing and the 2015 generation, which I think ties so beautifully into this event, because this is heritage. And I think that as somebody outside of the academy, that moment struck me outside of the academy. And I guess I want to ask you, Desiree, about that moment as somebody working inside of the academy. And before I do, I just want to read another bit of this incredible book, just to set the scene, I think, for the question. So this book approaches Blackness in a very, very complex way, which I absolutely love, but just for everybody's sort of understanding, it approaches it from the Biko Black consciousness perspective, but the editor's right. Amid this vigorous debate, the editors of SARChI seek to reactivate the sense of political Blackness associated with Black consciousness. The return to political Blackness gained currency with the rise of the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall movement since 2015, a period of concerted activism around identity politics and feminism. This period has seen calls to decolonize education, interrogate the trappings of post-apartheid democracy, and critique Rainbow Nation myth-making and its obsession with reclaiming cultural difference. Now, there's a lot more that I could read about that, but I absolutely love that the book is very much also an attempt to bring that 2015 generation into this conversation and to have the intergenerational conversation. But I guess, Desiree, I want to speak to you a bit about that moment as somebody who works inside of the academy and what that moment meant to you. In terms of the national memory, and if at that moment you were aware of memory making, because for someone outside of the academy, when that Rhodes thing fell, I mean, I was sitting at home saying, look at these kids, look at what they've done for me outside of the academy. So I guess my question to you, without the rosy glasses, is what was that experience like from within the academy, and why was that so very important for you to pull that into this collection?
Well, I have to say, you speak about myself as a very particular individual. You were saying that you were sitting at home. I was actually at UCT with some students, and it was overwhelming. It felt as if the world would change, because we'd been going through years of, feeling that things were simply not shifting. And the academy was proving itself to be, as an institution, because I think very often there's confusion when we talk about the academy. There are students, but the academy as an institution has become more conservative than it has ever been. And students were able to resist that at a time when it was absolutely important to have that kind of rebellion, to challenge the commercializing of education, to challenge the ongoing racism. There's been a severe backlash against that, and a lot has been co-opted. So for us, for Habiba and I, it was extremely important to capture that kind of energized post-apartheid consciousness of the need to re-energize and rethink an intersectional feminism that took into account current economic, racialized, and gender dynamics, which are shifting, which of course the previous generation has tried to keep up with, but a current generation is even more alert to. So of course it was extremely important. I was cynical about the academy before because the academic institution is toxic. Let's not pretend that it's not.
Well, that's what I love about your dedication in the book. I mean, you dedicated to the teachers, to our teachers and our students, and in memory of Elaine Salo. And I think that recognition both of teachers and students and generations that are moving, and that this is a heritage, not that feminism doesn't just like pop up in unrelated ways from generation to generation. You're really making that connection of a generation handing on the baton. And I suppose, Habiba, my question to you is, how important was it to you sitting outside of South Africa watching that moment? What did that moment mean to you, and why do you think it is important to not just memorialize that moment, but as you do in the book, you don't just tie that moment to the sparking of a new feminist movement, that this young generation, a spontaneous rise and an interest in African feminism. Did you notice that spontaneous rise, and what did it mean to you to see this happening from the US?
I was profoundly moved and chastened as one of the older feminists. I was also struck by the fact that the feminist students who formed part of the larger movements refused to accept the long-standing, by now, over a century's worth of feminist activism, even if it was not named as such. By now, South African feminists in movements had grown used to the assertion that they should wait, and the important struggle should be fought first, and then, later on. These feminists did not do that. They did not accept that leadership could be sexist and violent towards women, but playing an important role in the major struggle. They did not accept that sexual violence was a price to pay for feminist activists to be part of important national struggles. So they articulated something that I think was unprecedented. And that to me was incredible. It was incredible because I recognized how important, how it marked a moment in the nature of struggles in South Africa. I don't think it was spontaneous, Gail. I think that there has been a transformation of the public sphere in South Africa from the late 1990s, when feminists were, and women generally were, becoming aware of how the sexism of apartheid and the sexism of the anti-apartheid struggle and the homophobia of both of those, unfortunately, both of apartheid and large parts of the anti-apartheid struggle, continued into the post-apartheid space, and that women were going to have to create new spaces, often invisible to the dominant culture. And for me, one of the great examples of this is around feminist poetry. From the late 1990s onwards, feminist poetry was remaking public space in ways that were very obvious to those of us who were in poetry. I remember Desiree, when she organized conferences in the early 2000s, always insisted on the presence of poets, of performances, of visual art. So, making the space together. Outside of the academy, Fila Sister were selling out their own books, their own performances, entering radio, entering television. Names of scholars like Pumla, like Amina, like Mary, like Desiree, were no longer just confined to the academy. So I think that there was a transformation of the sphere of what counts as truly liberated. And it was out of that strength that the students were insisting on the fact that feminist struggles were of equal importance, which had not happened before. And I think this was truly a reflection of a national shift. And this is part of the promise of feminism.
And I really love how you contextualize that in your editor's note and then in the collection as well. And it brings me, I don't know how much time we have. I could talk the hind leg of a donkey. So unless someone actually comes and takes me off, we'll be here till midnight. So somebody needs to raise a flag if I'm supposed to keep getting off here. But I think, thank you, Habiba. I'm sorry if I'm treating this like a journalist. I'm just hurtling on to the next thing, but I have so many questions that I wanted to speak to both of you about. There's so much about this book that I love, and I think you really, really take on some holy cows here. And I love your take on intersectionality. Okay, Sibukazi is saying something. Okay, I must close, I think. But anyway, I want to come to the issue of intersectionality, which you write. Intersectionality, a buzzword in recent debates about feminism, has fueled an industry of research, often driven by white academics. This is because the term has been understood not so much as an attentiveness to power, but as an engaging with the confluence of identities. And honestly, I nearly fell off my chair when I read that. And I want to come to this issue of the popularization of intersectionality. And I'd like you, Desiree, to please speak a bit about your approach in this to intersectionality in this book. Specifically, if you could, please just speak a little about Jasbir Puar's notion of assemblage and why you chose that as your sort of approach, or why it is your preferred approach.
I'm going to respond to that in what might be an odd way, which is to go back to the discussion of why it is to think very carefully about the importance of Black South African feminism somehow intervening into a tradition, a canon of feminism, which is dominated by African American thinkers. There are certain perspectives, certain ways of looking at the world, which have to do with a very particular locatedness, which is a result of what many people call intersectionality, being situated in power. What has happened in a lot of work, a lot of activist work, a lot of academic work around intersectionality is that intersectionality has simply come to mean that you add race to gender to class, which is of course the old 80s thing of triple oppression, and people were doing that a long time ago. And that's exactly what was critiqued, because that just meant that you were seeing, for example, Black women as having layers of oppression, whereas white women had 2 layers or 1 layer, whatever it was. And of course, still working with the idea of certain identities being normative. So the idea of the white woman, white womanhood somehow being a standard of femininity. When you think about Jasbir Puar, and it's not necessarily to elevate her, but it's just that her discussion of how intersectionality works points very clearly to the fact that they are it's constantly shifting. And what one is thinking about are not the identities or the power relations that one ends up with, but the power systems, the changing power systems that lead to those identifications in the first place. And it's these power relations that we need to grapple with. And I think in many ways, spontaneously, when we actually spoke to writers and said, speak to what it means for you to be a feminist, there was a kind of a spontaneous immersing of the self in intersectionality. With people like Zetu talking about a legacy of queer agency and queer politics that had nothing to do with the West. And of course, unpicking all kinds of complexities. So, these are the kinds of things, these are the kinds of stories, these are the kinds of intricacies that mean that intersectionality is always very much linked to unraveling positions in power. So a long-winded response to your question. I hope that made sense.
Thanks, Desiree. I've been told I need to ask my last question and wrap up. So I'm very cross about that because I could go on all day. I mean, this is an incredible collection, and I'm really cross that I'm not in it. I just want you both to know I'm going to put my name on the cover. I'm just going to take a red pen and put my names. I mean, this is a collection that you want to be in.
Say, Gail, that
okay. I am so wounded. So hurt. I know. I'm going to take a little pen and just put Gail Smith in there somewhere because it really is. I mean, I'm making light of it, but I think that's the groundbreaking.
The cover lends itself to doing that. But on a serious note, it's, I think that looking back for both Habiba and I, and of course, this means opening up more and more. But, we could kick ourselves and think, well, why didn't we? So, yeah. But one also realizes that this is the kind of development of writing and canon formation that is so much needed.
Yes.
It
Please, Gail.
It really is. It's an incredible collection, and both of you should really take a bow. I mean, I'm jesting about not being in, but it is the collection that you do want to be in, and I hope it's the first of many, because you say that no collection is definitive, and you speak a lot about the choices and how difficult this was editorially to find that balance, which I really appreciated. But as I've now had a red flag waved at me, I'm going to ask my last question of both of you, and then I'm going to get off. So part of what this festival, or what is being done here, really is to look at what kind of worlds these books imagine, right? What kinds of worlds do they imagine? What kinds of worlds do they confront? What kinds of worlds do they undo? So in closing, I think I'll go first to Habiba and then come to you, Desiree. In editing this collection and between ideation and production, what for you, Habiba, in terms of what you got in the end, what was the most profound undoing or confrontation that this book forced you to face up to or imagine? And the same question to Desiree, and then I guess we need to take questions, I'm not sure.
I think for me, what a gorgeous question, by the way, Gail. I think it allowed me to see that the people who had been part of my growing up as an intellectual, the people who are among my group of very dearest friends, the people whose ideas have sparked mine, that they constitute a cohort which really can reshape knowledge, which can reshape. Already they are present in my teaching, but they can form a book. A book is a weighty thing, an important thing. A book can last for thousands of years. A book really matters. And so I don't think I had grasped that we constitute a book. And so I undid that assumption that we were not yet there. And that was really, really, really important for me as a personal point of growth. And it's just lovely to be surrounded by writing of this exquisite quality. You know, aside from all the other achievements, intellectually, politically, philosophically, theoretically, aesthetically, they are just so beautiful. They're so gifted. So yes, that's what I had to undo. Thanks.
Thanks. Desiree, your final word, and then I have to wrap up.
I think for me, what was most important was the process of archiving knowledge, which is related to what Habiba's been talking about. And you referred to transgenerational conversations. I sometimes get rather uneasy with this notion of transgenerational implying sort of a major, rupture rather than some sort of continuity in conversation. So I can see you begging me to stop, so I will.
No, I'm not. I'm saying thank you, because that's what you were to me when I was this 25-year-old, like trying to figure out Winnie Mandela, and I just didn't know where to start, and then finding your work. And I think I've used your phrase interpretive mastery in everything I've written over the last 27 years. And I think that speaks to the power of scholarship, and it speaks to the power of the women inside who have been doing the work in a very toxic and difficult space. You've done the work, and I think, a lot of the writers and a lot of the interest in feminism really, really is down to the work that all of you have been doing inside and outside of the academy for so long. So thank you so much. I could literally, I didn't even get to a third of the questions that I wanted to ask you, and I hope we have another chance to engage. But I think I'm going to stop there and just say thank you very much. I don't know if I should check. I'm not very good at moderating this clearly. I need to check the chat for questions. No, I don't think there's any questions. So just thank you very much to Desiree and to Habiba, both of you. Your work, in addition to the other scholars that are being, spoken about today and through this festival, have really meant a lot to me. I mean, I love ideas. I'm not a nationalist, but I certainly know that my engagement with this country shifted profoundly after 1995, when I started to meet people like Desiree, like Habiba, like Shireen, like Khumla. I think it had a profound shift for me in terms of my engagement and sense of belonging to the community. So thank you so much for the work that you've done. And thank you to the university for inviting me.
Gail, can I take up that point for you, just because it's such a lovely point about this book, belonging and South Africa. You will notice and have noticed, and other readers will notice, that this is an expansive vision of South Africa that includes writers from Kenya, Zimbabwe, Eswatini. So how did we define South Africa if we were not bounded by that national boundary? And I think what you describe as a community, as people who bear the battles, participate in the debates, contribute profoundly as thinkers, as teachers, as comrades within a feminist community. It would have been unthinkable not to include the people who make up this community, and an artificial barrier like a passport would have betrayed that. So I think this is the other contribution that the book makes. What is South Africa in form of a sense of belonging? So thank you for raising that point as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I loved your notion of citizenship as participation, because I think it completely and utterly ties into our constitution and its notion of not citizenship, but belonging as participation and rights as participation. And I think for me, one of the most beautiful things about this book is that it shows the long history of feminism in this country, but also it shows intersectionality being theorized and used long before Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, which is what you say. And I love that, because so few people understand that Section 9 of our Constitution is the intersectional feminist heart. How did it get there? It didn't get there by Somaswa. It got there because of a long tradition and heritage of feminist scholars working on intersectionality, which is why our most important document, the founding document of our democracy, has an intersectional feminist heart, and that's Black women's intellectual and scholarly labor right there. So thank you very much, both of you. I don't know, is somebody going to take me off the screen now?
Thank you, Gail. Thank you also, Phumla and Babalwa. I hope this event continues for many years to come.
Agreed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Lewis and Prof. Badaroon, and just also to Ms. Gail Smith, just for leading that conversation, and just I think right there at the end, as unfortunately time was limiting us, I think you were just really getting into deeper questions that it felt like a cliffhanger. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to now give way and give the platform to our next author, Dr. Atambile Masola, and by way of doing so, I'll read her bio. Dr. Masola is a writer, researcher, and lecturer at the University of Cape Town's Historical Studies Department. She recently published her first collection of poems in isiXhosa titled Ilifa. She has a PhD from Rhodes University focusing on Black women's historiography, intellectual histories, and life writing. She is a member of Bua Lit Collective, which is a group of researchers and educators advocating for the use of African languages as a social justice issue. She is the founder of Asnakuthula Collective, which is a group of teachers and researchers who aim to tell the stories of women's narratives through conversations on social media, as well as hosting the annual Maxwell Mqwetho lecture. She is a Mandela Rhodes Scholar, and Dr. Matambile is also one of the creators of the podcast Umoya on African spirituality. Her writing has been published in a variety of publications, as well as magazines and newspapers, such as Prufrock, Sable Literary Magazine, Al Jazeera, Mail and Guardian, Sawubona, The Guardian, online blogs, and academic journals. I'd also like to welcome to the platform Uapiwe and Tlemez. I was going to lead the conversation. Uapiwe is a master's graduate in sociology from the University of Fort Hare. Uapiwe is also a feminist writer and researcher, and has participated in several stakeholder engagements across the sub-Saharan region to shape policies on gender-based violence and femicide and adolescent sexual and reproductive health. She has further led and organized numerous protests and movements addressing gender-based violence in the Eastern Cape. And she's also affiliated with the chair in African Feminist Imaginations at Nelson Mandela University. All right, Uapiwe, over to you. Uapiwe, I don't seem to be hearing any sound from you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, you're clear.
All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Uapiwe Ntlamaza. I'm under the chair in African Feminist Imagination, doing my PhD. Thank you for welcoming us. But within the session, I just want to say that how I feel so honored to be part of such remarkable authors, but most importantly, to introduce even Dr. Atambile Masola, who has written this amazing book of collections, Ilifa. I must say, Doc, actually, I am quite a fan. I've started reading that, and I do have my favorite poems already. But welcome, Doc. And can you just please, for us, just take us through what is Ilifa all about, and perhaps just the different themes that come up in this book before we just go into it. Welcome, Doc.
Hi, Uapiwe, and hello to everybody, and thank you so much to the center and the team behind this wonderful event. Yeah, I guess Ilifa is a collection of poems ezibhalwe ngesiXhosa. It's organized into 3 sections. Eyokuqala ithi umyalelo wentombi. Now it says I'm muted, sorry. I'm not in my usual space, so if things go a bit haywire, I'm sorry. Eyokuqala ithi umyalelo wentombi, eyesibini ithi uthando, and eyesithathu ithi apha. And I guess xa abantu bezifundela, bezibonela, they'll see why those 3 sections and how I grouped the poems according to those themes. They're also the titles of the poems that appear in those sections as well.
Thank you so much. I'd like to read a part of, I think, my favorite, because I also shared this on social media. And I had a lot of people actually saying that this also resonates with them. And it's this poem of yours is called Coconut. It says, if you can just allow me, it says, Kauzitute, ditin zitute. I don't know what that means. Awukwazi ukuzithuta. I don't know what that means. Iziduko zakho zithini? Sorry, zithini. Oh, is that what you mean? Well, my dad only gave me 5. Said I wouldn't remember zonke. Zithini ke? Mamgcina, nokwindla, amela, ncancashe. Well, forgot the last one. Elusha, maybe. I'm reading this specific poem of your book of collections because, like I said, it's very personal, but also it does speak generally in terms of language. It does speak in terms, it covers also culture. But I'd just like to understand from you how, because there's a lot of debate in terms of language and how it's particularly used, right? And what should and should not be used. So what I'd like to understand from you and how you use language specifically, do you think that sometimes authors, specifically when they're writing in our own Nguni languages or native language, is there perhaps some sort of rigidness that is still there? How do you interlink the language that you use to also captivate the reader, as you did specifically with the coconut?
So for me, poetry is not, I mean, poetry is not something that's just cerebral, as you say. And I think Jonga, I guess in Bongo, people like Umkai or Jolobe or Kanye or Same Page Yako. You see that rigidness that you're talking about. It's in stanzas, it must rhyme a particular way. And I can understand that because so one of the challenges as Xhosa is that while indlela esithetha ngayo nendlela that we see it being used in pop culture is far ahead in terms of what we then see in the written language. So the only people who are really having this conversation are the people who are writers, or maybe even in academia. And Nomalanga Mkhize has actually written about this. Whereas there's this obsession with that kind of respectability or this rigidness you talk about, as though the rest of the world is interested in this. So in as much as people will see my book and think that I've experimented, yes, I have on the one hand, but on the other hand, not in a way that isn't recognizable to people who are using Ulimi lesiXhosa or any other African language, which has moved and changed from when it was being spoken in the 1800s, etc. So, I mean, when I did English 1, Mzekelo, you would get an anthology where English 1 would want to show you sort of the English poetic tradition. And what the first poem would be Chaucer, which is like Anglo-Saxon, which isn't really Isingesi, but where Isingesi comes from. And all the way through to kind of modern day poetry. And what I've been saying to people a lot when this conversation comes up is, the way Shakespeare was writing or John Milton was writing is the only way we should be writing. And the way E.E. Cummings or Mary Oliver or any kind of modern poet is not writing in English. Right? So, but somehow kusiXhosa, we've done that. We say, if awubhali njengomqhayi okanye umgqwetho okanye usenpage yakho, don't ungasibhali isiXhosa. Siyekele ukuthi thina abantu basazi isiXhosa samanyanyana. Which thing is outrageous, because then kubani ozobhala ngolo hlobo? Because sure, mhlawumbe utata uSawule nabanye notata uMona basathetha ngolo hlobo, but actually ulwimi has shifted. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with that. It's just that is actually just what happens. Abantu baphila ngolu hlobo, ulwimi must reflect indlela abantu abaphila ngayo. So that's what that's what I wrestled with a lot, even as I was publishing the poems, because I felt, I know I'm going to have to explain this because of where we are. In particular, pop culture is not having these conversations, unfortunately, or fortunately.
You make quite a very valid point, right? And within your book, and these themes keep on coming up, right? But also what makes it, and I guess what makes it, and that's your point of pop culture is not really, also we don't talk like that in our general life, right? And in most of your themes as well, that's why it makes the book is actually readable and relatable for also someone like me, right, as a feminist who feels like, unfortunately, I can't read isiXhosa, isiNzulu as deeper, galandlela, right? And this is basically that platform for us. But what I'd like to just understand from you with this book that you have, right? You've highlighted that how you transcended from your writing, but the language that you use, in that you use also emotive language. You cover also women's struggles, right? You also, especially even with Coconut and Hlati, where you talk about even your background, knowing your culture, your identity. Why would you think that is important? And specifically preserving our Nguni languages. Why is it? Why should that be important?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm trying to do it in a more ironic way, especially with the poem Coconut. So I'm not coming at it directly. And I think I'm writing it from the place of, I mean, that poem, Coconut, is about intloni, right? So, ulucha, lulahlekile, aniyazi, imbali yenu, hanana, all those things that they say about us. No one actually says, well, what are we actually doing with what we actually do have? So that's why that poem, as much as it's like cringy, I want it to be cringy, because actually we're dealing a lot with that ukolomfana that I've started following on Twitter and Instagram, who's just giving me so much life right now. But Ngulo Tatum Cools wants me to go to the lollies. I don't know if people can just share in the chats. I feel so bad that and then Tatum Cools is asking me about Umakoti. And he does kind of these spoofs about this conversation that he's having about his sexuality and how he is this fabulous queer person, and it's just not fitting in with the expectations as Akokwabo. So that for me, it kind of captures, again, this example I'm making about pop culture, is that people have caught onto that, but no one actually spends the time to say, okay, then what are we doing with the language that we have? So that's what I wanted to do. And to have a conversation, I mean, and that's what the title poem is about, Ilifa, is to have a conversation about inheriting loss. Because I'm like, yeah, because that's what actually happened. We were dispossessed. We did lose things. But no one wants to talk about the fact that we actually lost things. And we actually lost things in very systemic ways. Growing up in poverty, not because we're poor, but because systemically and structurally we've been made poor. So, and I want the language itself to kind of mirror that reality. So the kind of language I use, people will say, I guess, is simple. And I kind of write very short sentences. Whereas sometimes even in the poems, I write short poems. I've noticed Xhosa poems love to be long one way or another. So I've also written short poems. So that kind of conservation of language speaks to that loss, but also speaks to something new that has happened. So even while there is loss, ikona lendo sinayo. And so you use lendo unayo in order to be able to communicate. So they can only see that but they don't see what we've been able to create in spite of those losses. So I hope that is communicated in the poetry, is that you can lose things, but you can still live despite or in spite of those losses. But it's not to say that, because when they say whatever, there's also a shaming there. So I'm also going to say, well, I'm not going to be shamed into silence. If that's what you want, but not all of us have that. But so it also just comes with as well.
I very much love that, because as we know that also feminism is very much affirming who you are, right? And this is particularly what you do in this book. but also with the work that has been done under the chair of Feminist Imagination. I love how you just take us through, but like considering the academic space, especially when it comes to authors and writing and language and storytelling, especially in terms of the erasure of women in history as well. How do you take this through in your book? I know that in your previous work as well, you've done a lot of work in terms of that. Also using even your native, our Nguni language. Just take us through, and what is the importance of doing that? And why now specifically, actually? You're muted.
In the collection, I have a poem, Ukuzilanda, where I write about this. I mean, a lot of the poems, even the poem Uhlati, is about that kind of erasure of not knowing enough about Uhlati, who is my paternal grandmother. And then Ukunyamalaliswa, as well as Izwi Elidala. And so I guess the poems are a reflection of these questions that I'm posing. So, I mean, it's one thing I can write about listing, which is a theoretical or methodological practice that Brittany Cooper talks about, which I then adapt into Ukuzilanda. And then I can talk about it in my thesis, but then I can also talk about it in my poetry. And I actually can't remember which came first. Was it this poem Ukuzilanda, or I was writing about this idea Ukuzilanda, and which came first, the chicken or the egg? But I was also quite interested to see how that developed into the poetry, because obviously a poem or creative writing, it's not so much that you're looking out to see what's going to happen. I didn't plan any of these poems in any particular way. Ezinye I kind of experiment with as I kind of see them on paper, but it's also just about what you're observing or what you're hearing. I mean, a poem comes when you least expect it, and then you're like, oh, this is what this poem is doing. So I didn't necessarily plan it so that there is that kind of synergy, but I'm quite interested to see that there is that kind of synergy between my academic work, I guess, in that kind of way, but also with the poetry of Unyamalaliswa. And the poem Unyamalaliswa is about erasure. And about how we go to these places and people say, Asbalangando, Asiondo. Meanwhile, there's this rich heritage and rich lineage in literary history, but across all disciplines. It's been fascinating just to read almost behind every kind of important historic moment. It means Black women have always been erased from those historical moments. So that happened, it happened without me planning it. And I think the poem Ukuzilanda, I write about how I come to some of these women through other women. So a lot of my own kind of feminist scholarship or feminist enculturation in a kind of scholarly way has come through other feminists who have helped me along, who have said, Ina funda lento, or do this or do that, or look here or read this person. So it's been quite, I wanted to pay homage to my friends as well. And I know many of them were shocked when they saw their names in a poem because it's weird, but I thought, let me do it anyway.
Thank you so much for that. I must say though, I do how you, like you've just said, how you played around the terrain of language, exploration, just the sticky translation, as on just not being apologetic as a feminist, right? Later on, I might just ask you in terms of the gaps that you think that still need to be addressed and worked on in terms of the academia space. But I'm very interested, Ulifa, which is the last poem in your book, right? So here, Uti, and you actually just alluded to this earlier on. You say, ezingcondo impumlo encinci ezizandla ezigadla-gadla nezinwele ezishiyeneyo igagu ukundweba ukuzigqaxa ukuzithanda ukuzidla andinamfuyo andinandlu andinamhlaba. Sure, that is painful for me, because especially those three last words, andinamfuyo, andinamdla, andinamhlaba. How do you play into within this book? And I see with this particular three words where you highlight important factors within the struggles that women face, especially in South Africa as well. And this is basically your ending as well. And so what was the idea around that? What were you trying to highlight and put up as a discussion, as a final basically poem in this book?
I mean, I don't know if I wrote it as I just want to take a few steps back before I answer you. There's a strange thing that we do when we're talking to even writers and poets, and I know that I do this as well, as someone who like analyzes poetry. And maybe I could ask, what did it do for you, rather than me explaining why I did it? Because I think what some poems do is that you're genuinely ubhala isingqala sakho, in a sense. And sometimes isingqala is just that. You don't know how to explain it, and poetry helps to do that. So if I were to unpack that poem in any kind of particular way, because I think it's I don't embellish it, I don't flower it up. It is exactly as sparse and as kind of very simple and as clear as it is. So I think on the one hand, yeah, it's all there in those three words. Even while the title, it's like the paradox, even though the title, because so kwinjebo, either kukho indlu ekuxatyanwa ngayo, okanye room divider kamakhulu, okanye zitya zikamama, okanye umhlaba othile kufuneka wohlulwe. And so yeah, I guess what I was saying earlier, what does then it mean to inherit something that you don't have? And for me, it's on the one side of my family, it's been generational insofar as poverty is generational. In the same way, wealth is generational, or loss is generational. You know, in other families, they'll even go as far as saying, as though but that's a generational narrative that you then start kind of believing or growing up with and thinking, well, Ndotile is not possible for us. And some of that is spiritual, some of that is structural, some of that is material, some of that is intangible. Yeah, and so I guess that's what I was trying to write there, but I wanted it to be as, not so much I wanted it to be, it came out as sparse as possible. The fact that, I mean, that's a poem that is a list. It's unheard of in terms of isakhiwo sombongo ngesiXhosa, you know. You have to pack words in esiXhoseni because we love those sounds, because otherwise it's engumbongo, you know. I was at an event earlier and Steve Biko Center, and MEC was there. It was a whole big thing, and of course izawuphakama imbongi ekhoyo, and you know I understand that that is that oral history, and it's important, and that oral poetry, and it's beautiful. But what I can do is write in this particular way. And so it's also important for me to honor the fact that for me, yeah, I don't know if the pendulum was over.
No, you certainly did. Thank you so much. I have one last question before I even read the other questions from the chat. I do see this as a book that will be influential within the academic space, particularly when you're linking it to modernization and how and the language that is typically used and relatable to young people. However, I know we've spoken about some like how you've done even a comparison analysis of previous authors, established authors, authors and writers that are excellent as well, in trying to relate and display as to how you or why you used this language that you use. I want to understand, what do you think, as Dr. Atambile, is the gaps that are there in making such work recognizable, but also what are the gaps that hinder progress when it comes to the African literature and how we basically tell our stories?
So I think back to maybe the language question, to answer the first part of your question. I was quite struck. So today at the event that I was at, Umtunzi was also there, and she read Unonga Indoda, and I read Ikaka. And it was so interesting, in reaction yabantu to Ikaka. I mean, it was a room full of abantu abadala. And one of the things they said, which was so interesting, was sinalendo yokuthi isiXhosa sirhabaxa okanye kukho amagama athukayo. Whereas xa usiya ke andingosemambondweni, abantu basemambondweni bazoyazi le nto, but kuthiwa xa usiya ngasemambondweni okanye amabhaca bathethe esinye isiXhosa kodwa kuthiwe amabhaca krwada, but bathethe isiXhosa sithile. So people will, I mean, maybe they were just being nice and generous because, you know, ndingumntana or whatever, because that's the kind of framing that they want. Oh, basathethi kamnandi abantwana. And but they made this point that even the word Ikaka, there's nothing inherently rude about that word, but bakhona aba bantu, because isiXhosa comes from this rigid past where Ilaf del Bres used to be so invasive and censoring, and the language boards were so invested in the kind of political and narrowing of isiXhosa in a particular way, that now the only kind of isiXhosa that we have in written form must be respectable, must be didactic, must be doing, you know, the model citizen that Unamalanga writes about. So, yeah, I mean, and then someone asked me, you know, what made me so brave to write that poem and use those words. I was like, it's not really brave, which is why the poem comes out that way. So Ukaka was just a word that we have, you know, and that's just the way that she spoke. So I just thought that was very interesting for me, is that how and when do these languages shift? And then to your second question, I don't know if I answered the first part of your question, but to the second part, I mean, the knowledge economy and the cultural economy when it comes to African languages is just a minefield, you know, a minefield in the sense that so there's the bookshops, and there's certain bookshops. So there's like the big chains, your exclusive books, your bargain books, and then you've got the independent bookshops. And a writer, Opala said to me, look, the people who are really going to champion you are the independent bookshops. So your Clarks, your Fogarty's, your Book Lounge, Book Circle Capital, the not big chains. Whereas the big chains, and they also up your price. So I mean, the book is retailing at 180, but exclusive books like taking stuff for 185 because that's what exclusive books does. And I'm glad at least I kind of knew Gekakulu. But even with that kind of process, they only stock one book at a time. Because because I went to them twice and and they didn't do that. Whereas Isipulu, and we were talking about this at the workshop earlier this week, whereas Isipulu is a language that was not a language when Isixhosa was first written in the 1800s. Isipulu only became a language as a process. Isipulu in the sense of Afrikaner nationalism, Isipulu, because Afrikaans has a longer history outside of what Afrikaner nationalism did to it. Only really became a language because Amabulu understood in order to build their nationalism, they built it around an identity, and that identity needed a language, needed a culture, needed a story. But you will never struggle. Never ever struggle to find incwadi zesibhulu if you walk into exclusive books or bargain books. Never, even though they are like I don't know if they're number 3 or number 4 in terms of the most spoken languages in the statistics. So isiZulu is the first one. Isingesi, I think, is number 4. So I think it's isiZulu. Maybe it's Xhosa and Phazami, and then Afrikaans, and then Isingesi if Isingesi is not number 5. So that tells you that picture already of how the knowledge economy is designed in terms of who gets in, who gets out, or who gets left out. And the truth is, the fact that we went with this publisher also speaks to that. So Nick, I've known him for a longer time when I was writing for Proofrock. And Ibeli Tamsanga, that we started talking about poetry and where he was going, and was like, he's looking for African language poets. Not so much he was looking, but someone had submitted, and I was a reviewer for one of those submissions. And then Dateta Nomtunes, I was like, can I introduce you to Nick? Because I say thesis, you'll hear her story tomorrow. But that's how it happened. It happened because I know Nick. And the fact that it looks this way, Nick has got a production line that makes books be able to, I mean, the number of people who just like, I just want to have it, even if I don't know the language, it's just so beautiful. I just want to have it in my life. And Yotusa Nambana, oh my gosh, I didn't expect it would look like this. Yeah, sure, I approved it, but I was like, I don't know what it's going to look like as an end product, you know? So the aesthetics, even of that process, you know, you can tell it's quality because African language books are not great quality, or whatever those perceptions are. And then, of course, all the politics about self-publication. Part of the reason why the big chains don't stock African language books is they think that we've all self-published. I mean, unless you're getting published for the school market, and then that's a whole other conversation about how the school market works. Even though everyone is complaining, even today at this event, but, well, then why are you not making space? Why is it, I mean, Gogomteto, DAC, DASRAC, all those provincial departments are supposed to be buying books for libraries. So if you just think of it mathematically, however many number of libraries there are, the Western Cape in terms of is Xhosa, and maybe Joburg or other places, I'm just thinking geographically in terms of how things are organized. If let's say there are 30 or 50 libraries that need to be stocked, if Desiree is buying those 50 books, that's already 50 books I don't have to worry about. That's 50 books that my distributor doesn't have to stress about. The question is, how does that process happen? Just libraries. That DBE is then supposed to help stock. Mind the fact that we had a library campaign in South Africa where we know that school libraries are not available in other schools. So you're also walking into a context where people will say, I mean, of course, has told me the story so many times, people will say, oh no, poetry doesn't sell. And then people blow that out the water. Then people say, oh no, but African languages don't sell. And then, you know, we find ourselves in a situation where people are buying our books. Oh no, poetry, yes, of course, it doesn't sell. And so it's these constant messages that you're getting where people are constantly saying to you, no, it's not going to sell, it's not going to work. And then when you actually do it, people are excited, people are going out there and getting the books and sharing the books. So that's it's a complex sort of context that we find ourselves in. But I think the joy for me has been able just to see what happens, you know, so and is to do it and not to listen to that voice that says I mean, there's obviously always that fear for any writer because we write for ourselves mainly, but also once it's out there, then you want people to engage with it. So it's a very, I wouldn't say hostile, but that's the word that's coming to mind. It's a very complicated context that we're finding ourselves in. And yeah, there's also just a lot of talk, you know. I'm just saying people who are like, but you haven't created an ecosystem for them to be able to do these things.
Exactly.
Whereas language boards, for all its problems, the reason why apartheid worked in terms of the language thing is because they had institutions in place. But somehow come post-1994, we don't have institutions in place to do this work in a way that doesn't make talking about African languages as though we're tribal. Because oh, you're being tribal, or what's the other word? You're being a hotep, and so then and yes, English is the language that in that one sense. But for me, I've come to, I mean, and most Black people know this, for Black people, the default is multilingualism or bilingualism. So how can that be reflected more in ways that as Sotusi, in ways that it doesn't make us feel like you're doing something, you constantly have an agenda, because there's also that, I was just writing poetry and I just wanted to share it. But now I kind of also have to talk about the politics of language. I have to talk about the politics of the work before I even get to the work itself, you know?
I really do understand. Thank you so much, Doc. But before I move on, I'd like you to just tell our audience where they can find and buy and for how much this book. And then in your, we have here, colleague says, Dr. Masola, thank you for umsebenzi wakho omuhle. I am interested in your inclusion of your grandmother's photography on the cover. Why was this important for you? I am thinking about photographs as Ifa or Ilifa. And then a second question from Dr. Babalwa Magoqwana. She says, thanks, Atta, for this collection. I am wondering if we can chat more about the way your book has been received in terms of using isiXhosa usage for publication processes. I love how you make sure that this collection is not stagnant in terms of the use of isiXhosa language, I mean. And then you have here Gail Smith, who says, thank you, Dr. Masola. Your analysis of the knowledge economy is on point. Also, thank you for pointing out the making of a legacy and identity and the role of Afrikaans and language. Okay, let me just give you to answer the question by Dr. Babalwa and colleague, and then we can move on to the rest of the questions by the rest of the audience.
Sure, and I guess the first question that you asked about where people can get the book. So the book is available for 180. And initially when we started, we asked people to go to the shops and ask them to order it. So we had our own batch. So and I think says she had about 6 copies when I saw her earlier of each book. So, but so exclusive books, even though, I mean, eKapa, they've been so generous. Exclusive books, Cavendish stocks more than one, which is great. I mean, I say so generous, but like, you know, insofar as what I've just mapped out. So eKapa, it's exclusive books, Cavendish, Book Lounge, Clark's Books, and we're coming for a launch eKapa, hopefully end of November. eGauteng Book Circle Capital had our books, the Commune had our books, and where else? I think exclusive books, Rosebank, and then in the Eastern Cape, in Monty, it was bargain books, but you literally have to go to the counter and ask them constantly. They don't buy 4 or 5, which is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, I had to call and be like, because so it's a daily dispatch. On Monday, we had an article with them, and today they were interviewing us again. So that's been really exciting. But obviously, people can also buy online. For people, I had my first international order. A friend of mine has moved to Sussex, and they ordered a book via our international distributor, which is nice. So that's the one thing. And then when we do get into our second print run, we'll announce where people can get more from us, etc. But usually it was you just email us, and then we'll send you the bank details, and then we'll post them to you. So that we do that as well. And then kumbuzo ka kollega. I have a cough, so man is mute. Yes, so the cover is my grandmother. And why was it important? I mean, Ubele is such a legend in my life. So this is Ubele, who I write about in Ikaka and who I talk about. And it was interesting because someone asked me recently, is it because we had a close relationship? And that's a conversation for another day. But this is one of the books when we kind of had these seasons of up and down. And when we're in a good season in the family and everyone was talking, she gave me a copy of this photograph as well as ipasi lakhe, so a reference book, but she still had. And so I kind of always was going to blow up this picture and just have it in my house. There's also a beautiful picture of her parents, Five, where my cousin still say Gwa, because she's passed away 3 years ago. But this was such an iconic image because it was also the image that was on top of her bed in her bedroom. So it was always this wonderful memory where she used to talk about it. And when I asked my mom about it, she told me that, yeah, that was when she was in her 20s, actually. So the picture itself speaks, and I mean, Kollega knows this, you know, images speak to us in a way. They have a texture, they have a sound. And I think that captures it in a way, especially because she was also that kind of person for me who was just had such an attitude, you know. So for me to remind myself when I see this book of, you know what, I'm owning these words, they're mine, and I'm putting a picture of someone who represents just owning all her experiences was important for me in that way. And then Babs's question, say more about the way the book has been received in terms of using Xhosa usage for publication processes. So as I said, I spoke about what happened today, and I was actually very nervous about reading at that event because abantu basepondweni are just banenye texture, and I don't know, and they felt very generous, and maybe it is a very generous season because like there's kind of been this hiatus or gap in terms of where we are in literary output in that way. And so, yeah, I would say that the reception has been very generous. We've had a review. We had the article with Daily Dispatch. We had a review in the Brocott's Mail. Lots of people have been sharing it. And for people who have been talking about the book as well, it's that sense of, in the immediate reaction is, and then they look at them like, oh, okay. So it's kind of reviving a different kind of conversation in terms of how we think about Xhosa, which I guess is wonderful insofar as this conversation and where and how we locate ourselves in terms of how we change the texture of this conversation.
All right, thank you so much. We do have one last question from Pumla, and then we can just wrap up. So Prof. Pumla says, Atambile, I don't know what was more brilliantly done in this book, the deep feminist theorizing, the honesty, or the incredible emotional landscape. You give us a language, and usenza abantu. I don't think you should be so humble on the innovation you do with Xhosa, Upalangaso, though, on what you do with the body and ritual of self-love you teach, recite, and offer here over and over again across the three sections. I couldn't agree with her more. Thank you so much, Doc. Do you perhaps have any last words for us?
Sure. I mean, maybe and thanks so much to Pumla and to Gail as well. It's really, really encouraging, and more than encouraging, actually. Yeah, I think when Tunzi and I talk about our work, one of the things I didn't realize was happening until I kind of put it all together was this theme of love, and that's why the section Utando has got the most poems. And I guess it also emerges from the place I was at when I was writing some of these poems, and the range of love, you know. So there's intimacy, but there's also poems about, self-love in a way. And sometimes I've battled to find that kind of texture is Xhosa. So is Xhosa, kuthethwa ngeenyimbiba, kuthethwa ngenkosi ethile, kuthethwa ngentaba ethile, kuthethwa ngesiganeko, singonosiganeko, you know, sithetha ngonyaka omtsha okanye sithetha ngezopolitiko okanye, you know, so there's like these stock themes that African language poetry or literary work is about. And I've always felt it missing. That, I mean, of course, we call and in novels, but in poetry, I've often found it lacking. We love historical poems. So I was like, well, what if I just write, well, no, not what if I just write, but yeah, what happens when we talk about Xhosa in, I mean, my favorite, not so much my favorite, but that poem, Uthando, is also about all the simple ways in which Uthando is expressed, whether it's between parents and children, whether it's between lovers, but it's that range. So I'm glad I was able to do that, because I think I wrote the kind of poetry I needed at the time, and now I'm sharing it with everybody.
And now we all need thank you so much. It's been truly an honor to have this interview with you. Thank you so much, and I wish you all the best. I do just advertise this for everyone, including all the other authors' books as well. Please support feminist work. Thank you so much, everyone. Spokazi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Masola, and thanks, Apiwe, for facilitating that conversation. I think just as a way of not wasting any more time, colleagues, I'm going to bring up Asiphe Mxalisa just to do some closing comments and just a vote of thanks to close off our session. Asiphe is a research assistant at the Center for Women and Gender Studies, and she's currently doing a PhD in higher education at Rhodes University. Asiphe?
Thank you so much, Spokazi. Indeed, we were in a space where we did not need to explain ourselves, but unpacked, deliberated, and learned more about African feminism, as I echo my director, Dr. Babalwa Magutwana. Such moments where our generation gets to share the space with the giants and elders of feminism is a moment we do not take lightly. And also seeing people of our generation contributing and being part of the archival, creative, historic, and intellectual project of African women is a revolution in itself. So thank you, Lihle Ngcubozi, for sharing your work, which, as you mentioned, is a collaborative project on Umanyano women, the issues of representation and mothering. Your book lets us in to the complex and multidimensional group of women, Siyabulela. Of course, our very own Prof. Phumla Dineo-Qola, we can never thank you enough. You chose us at Nelson Mandela University, and that on its own is a privilege enough for us to thank you every day. Your conversation moved as a thread to Prof. Lewis and Prof. Baderon's conversation with Gail Smith. Thank you to all of you. Today we take your lessons on how we should start dissecting feminism, not only to decolonize language and knowledge in the academy, but also to take feminist writings from the doors of the academy to our communities by unpacking the barriers of language. We ended the day with Dr. Atambile Masola in conversation with Apiwe Ntlhameza. Thank you to the both of you. Siyabulela ngokungazenzi siyo. Part of dissecting and decolonizing language, as discussed in a book by Prof. Louis and Prof. Baderon, requires the important work that way, not Dr. Masola, through poetry and using isiXhosa to highlight the importance of using our native languages in feminist methodology and writing, as seen in your work. And thank you, Apiwe Ntlhameza, for leading the conversation to the questions that many who have read the book have. Colleagues and friends, as mentioned by Ntlhameza, these books are available online and on bookstores. To all participants present here today and on the YouTube page, from different communities, organizations, universities, regionally and globally. We thank you for joining us today. The program is not yet ending, so let us meet again tomorrow at 4 p.m. South African time. The links for day 2, if you have registered, should have been sent to you by now from the Center for Women and Gender Studies and the SARChI Chair in African Feminist Imaginations. We would like to say thank you, Siyabulela, goodbye, have a great night and great day. Thank you.